Good morning, everybody. Please join me this morning for our call to worship. The fool will fall before their joyful song, but maybe I will fall with him as well. You know me, Lord. You know how much I long to rise with you, how much I long to dwell within your tabernacle, to ascend the path that glimmers on your holy hill. But you know, too, how much I just pretend to virtues not my own. I am not fit for that ascent. I fail unless you lend your strength and take my life and make of it a new life altogether. Oh, descend into my darkness, lift me from the pit, and set me on the way that you intend, however slow and spiraling path. Then help me step by step, my guide and friend. Which is taken or adapted from Psalm 15 by Malcolm Guy.
We light this candle to remind us of the humanity of Christ, who lived a full human experience like us. So we can now embrace every facet of our humanity, body, mind, and heart, as part of our call to become like God. We light this candle to remind us of the divine nature of Christ, who overcame with love every evil we conceived, and whose resurrection proves to all of the world that love overcomes evil, sin, and even death.
Hey, good morning everyone, and welcome to my office. I am hanging out inside since it's like 90 and humid outside this week. So I decided to record from in here this week. And we're starting a new series today called True Religion. And it is a journey through the book of James. This is an epistle. It's later in the New Testament. And this whole true religion, it comes out of a very famous passage in the book of James that we're going to be covering today, where he says that true religion is this, and then he gives some definitions about it. So we're kind of doing this whole series based around that one phrase, and that's kind of the topic of the whole book. Anyways, I was really nervous to take on an epistle because I had kind of a fundamentalist discipleship as a teenager at a very conservative church, and there was a lot of do this and don't do that. And the book of James was always presented as here's the stuff that you're supposed to do and here's all the stuff that you're not supposed to do. So I've kind of been afraid to take on the epistles of my previous fundamental faith, and today we're taking it on. I'm not nervous anymore. We found some really great stuff in here. But the thing that we got to keep in mind as we're exploring the book of James, this is not a book about moral mandates. Here's what you got to do. Here's what you got to stay away from. Here's what's okay. Here's what's not okay. And it's a book about instruction on wise living, kind of like the book of Proverbs. Now, you don't read the book of Proverbs and say, do all the things, because in some cases in the book of Proverbs, it contradicts itself, even in one phrase right after another, where it tells you not to correct a fool because then you'll look like a fool. And then the very next sentence tells you that you should correct a fool because then you're allowing a fool to remain a fool. So the book of Proverbs is not a book of moral mandates. It's a book about instructive wisdom. Now, if we're going to adopt James as this moral mandates, then we're going to use phrases against other people when they do an action that we don't approve of or like. We'll say, well, the Bible says, and then we'll get out our clobber verse and knock them over the head. And that shows that we're using this book as a moral mandate for somebody else. And instead, we're supposed to use the book of James as a book of wisdom, as a book of instruction, for reflective living. James is a book about how to be here in this world, in a society that values power and pride and arrogance and prestige at the expense of other people. So how do we be here as people of faith? This is kind of what James is trying to get at. Now, right from the get-go, the book of James, it says that it's to a religious group of people. It calls them the Jews that are scattered in the diaspora, which is a really long, fancy way of saying it's religious people that scattered throughout the world into little minority groups. So the opening verses of this are encouragements on how faith can survive in adversity and how you can grow in wisdom through wisely traversing the adversities that you have. Now, our text today is not going to pick up in the very famous passages previous to this. We're going to pick it up in verse 17 through 27. So let's hear this passage read, and then we'll kind of dive into it on the other side. There's some really good stuff here. You're going to like it.
James 1, 17 through 27. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive ourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word and does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forget what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts is pure and faultless in this. To look after orphans and widows is their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world.
So the section right before today's section talks about faith persevering through adversity, through trial, and through temptation. And that is a really big section, very well known. The lectionary calendar actually has us skipping over that part, which is one of my favorite parts. But that section about adversity, this is a minority group receiving this letter that is in the midst of a broader political economic system that does not embrace their way of living. They're having to learn how to be here, be in this world, and be faithful at the same time, because they're dispersed, the Jews in diaspora, as it opens up in verse 1. So there is this like hard U-turn almost in verse 17, where it says that, you know, God is this giver of everything that is good and perfect that comes down from the Father of lights. Like, that's pretty, that's poetic. Let's put that on a coffee mug and sell it at the Christian bookstores around the world, right? But what the heck does that even mean? The Father of lights and every good and perfect gift. And how does that fit into where we actually are in this book and in this passage? Well, there's a differentiation that needs to be made that James starts right off the bat. He says, here's all this adversity, trial, and temptation that's coming your way. But I want to differentiate something right off the bat. God is the one who gives good things. God is the one who gives perfect things. There is no shifting moods within God. There's no shifting shadows. God is this consistent constancy with goodness and mercy that is just ever flowing on and aimed at our whole society. So he has to differentiate God is not the giver of the trials. God is not the giver of the hard things. God is not the giver of the tragedies and temptations of this life. Those come from within a broken world itself. But God is the one who gives the good and the perfect things in life. And this consistency of the goodness of God is something that James wants us to bank on. He wants to set this up really clear right in the beginning. You're going through all of this junk, all of this garbage, all of this difficult stuff in the midst of this world. And I need to be very clear with you all, that does not come from God. God is not the giver of trials, temptations, tribulations, all of those things. God is the giver of everything that is good and perfect. It comes down from the Father of lights, who has no shifting shadows. There's no moods in God that changes and all of a sudden he's crabby, so he's going to throw a lightning bolt down your way this day because you forgot to pray, or you didn't do this, or you did do that, you ought not to have done that, and you made God a little bit cranky, so now you got some stuff that you're going to have to pay for with some trials and temptation coming your way. James says, no, that stuff doesn't come from God. God is the giver of all that is good. And that is a consistency that he wants us to bank on. The next section here almost seems like it switches topics altogether again and goes into some kind of moral mandate about controlling your speech and your tongue. But really, James is building on an idea and a concept here. At first, he talked about adversity and temptation and trial and persevering through it. And then he talked about how God is this constant force of goodness in the world that you can bank on. And then all of a sudden, it feels like he just, switches a totally different direction and says, oh, by the way, good people don't say bad things. And let me get on with my point later. He actually is building on something here. And to show us how he builds here, the very first word that he uses in the Greek language can actually be translated, well, check this out. So check this out is kind of like, well, let me show you how this works. If God is this consistently good force in the world, everything that's good and perfect comes from God. Now he's going to give us this kind of check this out. This is how this works, kind of a phrase. So he's tying it to the previous truth of God being the source of goodness. He says everybody should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But our first knee-jerk reaction when we're approached with ideas and concepts that are foreign to us is to listen in order to understand, and not to listen in order to have this anger reaction. And this word anger means to have an agitated soul that desires to inflict punishment upon another person. That's the word anger here. And it's often used of judges and magistrates, of people with power that listen to cases and then feel a sense of indignation, righteous anger, and then bring a judgment or punishment down upon the guilty person in here. And it says that us, people of faith, are to have slower judgment reactions, slower anger reactions, slower speaking reactions, and listen in order to understand. And then here's the why, and here's how it ties up to the previous thought, because the indignation or the anger of humans does not create the justice of God. Us getting angry and then launching out to try and dismantle the people around us with their arguments and thoughts and persuasions and all that, getting angry and then being quick to anger and quick to speak and put people in their place, actually it does not achieve the justice of God that God is looking for in this world. So if God is consistently good and consistently, that's a consistency that you can bank on. What he's saying here is that you can't use evil to overcome evil, because it only perpetuates more evil. The evil you seek to resolve can't be resolved with more evil. It has to be done in an entirely different method. And being open to a kinder, more gentler way of bringing change to the world is the first thing he wants us to do, is be like God. Not be so irritable and moody and, quick to anger, not that God, not the false understanding of God, but this true God that has no shadows or shifting inside of him at all, but has a consistency that you can bank on. of goodness, and we're to be quick to listen and not quick to be throwing out judgments, because evil doesn't overcome evil. We gotta do this like God does. So verse 21 tells us to get rid of all filth and evil in your lives and humbly accept what God has planted in your hearts. This is a really tough phrase, filth and evil. Like that just sounds, I had to throw my Bible down. Like that just sounds like a little cringy, you know what I mean? Like, get rid of filth and evil. I can just imagine this, fiery, brimstony, Bible thumping somebody coming down upon people who are filled with filth and evil. Like, what does that even mean? Like, we tend to take those words and then put common cultural mandates upon them and say, oh, it means, A, B, C, and D. It means, back in the early 1900s, don't smoke, drink, dance, or chew, or go with girls that do. That was their actual saying that they had back in the 1920s. That's what they defined filth and moral evil and all that stuff there. And it seems as though culture redefines these things based on whatever is seen as the hot topic of the day or the hot sin of the day. Because I was like, what does that mean? And it means he's asking them here to set aside, to lay aside. And the actual Greek translation is the soul-tainting residue of ill will and a desire to injure. That sounds a little bit more like understandable than, filth and evil, which then we can interpret filth and evil into whatever we want it to be in our day and age, and whatever hot topics we want to insert in there, we can just go ahead and insert in there. But James here is specifically speaking of guarding the tongue and humbly enduring adversity in the midst of the world as people of faith. And that desire to see somebody else suffer, to see somebody else fall on their face, is this soul-tainting residue left over from this how we be in the world. Because we used to be in the world, this book talks about, and everything that is of the world, and that left a residue upon us about how we're supposed to get ahead in this world and be here. And James is trying to redefine how to be here in a different way. And if we can set aside our ill will and our desire to see other people injured and instead replace that stuff with a humility that receives, that says the Word of God. And when it says the Word, it's actually not talking about the Bible, because it wasn't like the Bible. They didn't even have the Gospels written or the epistles so much, maybe in select groups here or there. This is an early epistle, the book of James, so they don't have the Bible as we know it. So what are they talking about when they say the Word? Well, we're going to get into that in a minute, but this word that's been implanted within us, it says it has the power to do something. It has the power to save your soul. That's another revivalist saying would be like, you got to save your soul from the fiery pits of hell. You like my accent? That was my revivalist accent. What are they, because they're not talking about it. He has no mention of afterlife in that section there. To save your soul, that actually in the Greek means to keep or to guard your inner person safe and intact and not injured in this world. This inner word has the ability to do that. So what is he even talking about? What is this word? We're going to jump into that next. Now this next section here talks, it says the words, prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers only. And boy, is it really easy to take this modern American value of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just get her done by your own abilities and powers and read into this, that James is somehow taking that value that we hold and saying, yes, I just want you to get her done in whatever way possible you can. Be a doer and not a hearer. And that's not exactly where he's taken this passage. When I dove in, I was really interested in what I found. The word prove in the Greek is actually to arise in history on the world stage and be made into a person that can handle whatever situations are coming at us on the world's timeline currently. Now that's a little bit more like, whoa, to become somebody who can handle whatever the world is throwing at us at the moment. And there's a lot of things that our world is throwing at us currently. And we are to prove ourselves as people of faith, not in this finger wagging, prove it and do it and not just hear it kind of a way, but we are to arise on the world stage where we are today in the small communities that we find ourselves and become something. What should we become? This is what he goes into next. Now, this word doer is used, it's one of James's favorite words. He uses it 4 times. It's in a little tiny book. So if you use the word 4 times in a little tiny book, you know it's got to be one of his favorite words. And he says a doer, and he uses it 3 times just here in this passage. So it's very important. It's used one other time, and that one other time is in Acts 17, verse 28, where Paul is speaking to a group of Greeks who are not religious, who are not a part of the Jewish Christian faith. And he says, hey, I'm explaining something to you about our faith, and just as some of your poets have said, and then he quotes some of their poets, the word doer is actually the same word as the word poet. It's the same word as the word poet. It's somebody who's a creative maker of something. It's a meaning maker. It's somebody who's good at art, at song, at poem, at prose, at storytelling. Somebody who can take the regular stuff that's all around and then make it into something beautiful that we can all see. It's a creator. Somebody who creates like God created in Genesis 1. So here, Paul is saying, I want you to be doers, poets. This is the word poet, believe it or not. I want you to be poets of what? The word. Now this word, it is the word logos, which we see in John chapter 1 when the logos becomes flesh. The logos was Christ, and the logos puts on human flesh. So this logos is not the word as in the written Bible, but the revelation of God in Christ is the word. And all that God desires and all that God is, as seen in the person of Jesus, and everything that is, all of that has been implanted into us and our spiritual DNA. And he's saying, I don't want you to be just a hearer of who God is and who God made you to be. I want you to be a poet with it. I want you to create something out of that. He says a hearer, somebody who just hears it from an external source being audibly said and just hears it, is a self-deluded person. So if we take this external hearing, we pair it with internal listening, that leads to a creative expression out in the world of something. But if we just hear the thing, but we don't have an internal listening to it, then it's only ideas. And that leads to thinking that we're thinking, but we're not thinking, because we're really just adopting ideas that somebody else pushed upon us. The pre-approved ideas, the pre-approved answers to all of the pre-approved questions that somebody else told you were important. But are they your questions? Are they your concerns? Is it how God has shaped you to be? There is a word that is in you, that God made you. That is the next section here. It goes into this phrase about looking at yourself in the mirror. And it's not because you got broccoli in your teeth. Every time I've heard this passage taught about, it's like somebody who's a hearer but not a doer is like somebody who looks at themselves in the mirror and goes away forgetting what they look like in a negative sense. Every time I've heard it taught, it was you looked at yourself in the mirror, you saw you had some broccoli in your teeth, and then you left. You forgot you had broccoli in your teeth and you left it there. Or you had a big zit on your forehead and you're like, oh, I should take care of the zit. Every time I've ever heard this passage taught about, it's about looking into the mirror to find your blemishes so that you can do something about it and then move away a better person than when you looked at the mirror. There is no negatives actually in the Greek about this passage. There's no negatives about looking in the mirror and then walking away and forgetting. There isn't anything that says about and then not correcting yourself or not getting the broccoli out your teeth or anything like that. This is really interesting. The mirror exposes not your blemishes. The mirror exposes your identity. There is a phrase here that says somebody who sees their natural face. And this word natural face, I looked it up in the Greek, it actually means Genesis. The word there for natural is the word Genesis. To seize their Genesis face, their created face, their natural face, the one that God gave them, their identity, their original beauty before you accomplish or fail anything, your intrinsic value before you act or do or anything. When you see yourself as God sees you, when you stop and look in the mirror without judgment. And when you stop, that's your Genesis face. That's the created face that God gave you, the created intention and your original beauty. When we see that by gazing into the goodness of God, when we see that, but then we walk away and forget what we look like, forget who we are, and then we mindlessly go about our days trying to earn our value and prove our beauty out in the world by doing and doing and doing, then we get lost in this worldly way of thinking. But those who gaze, this next section here says, those who gaze into this kind of a mirror and remember, they become productive poets of beauty in the world. Those who gaze into the mirror and aren't seeing all of their blemishes and all of their ugliness and all of those who gaze into it and see their Genesis face, those are the ones who become the industrious authors of justice in the world. Not the people who are just yelling and trying to injure people and muscle their way up to the top and get things done that way. Because anger does not accomplish the justice of God. Those who gaze into their mirror and see their beauty will be able to see that beauty out into the world as well. It says that they will be blessed in what they do. And the word blessed there means happy. You'll be happy and content in what you do if you can gaze into your Genesis face that God gave you and walk away and not forget what you look like. Not forget who God made you to be. Not forget your intended, created beauty of a person that you are. So James here closes out this idea in verses 26 and 27. He says that if our worship of God, this religion here in the Greek means our worship, God worshiper. So if our worship of God is merely ideas, opinions, and ideals that we passionately and emotionally adhere to, but they're all just in our head, and we are willing to fight people over these passionate ideas, opinions, and ideals. We're ready to go to the mat. We're going to go on to Facebook and we're going to all caps that person who's obviously totally wrong in their entire persuasion of how this world ought to operate. If that is all our religion is, it says that our hearts are deceived. And the hearts mean the seat of emotion, our seat of emotion. It says that we have tied this emotional passion to an ideal that's just an idea of how the world ought to be, but it actually doesn't change anything because we're just passionately arguing and fighting over our opinions about stuff. And he says that religion deceives the heart because our emotions are tied to it so strongly we're willing to fight people over it. And it feels so right to prove people wrong, right? Doesn't it? He says that kind of religion is empty of any kind of transforming force. In some translation, it says that is worthless religion. And the word worthless there means that it has no purpose and no power within it. As Paul will tell Timothy, it has this facade of godliness, but lacks the power within to transform anything. So then true religion, true worship of God in God's eyes, he says, is this. There's two things. One is to visit and see the orphans and widows in their affliction and distress. That's the first thing. Now, orphans and widows in this society were the most vulnerable people that were easily oppressed, easily kicked to the side, that were easily in beggar status. Orphans and widows had no one to take care of them in this society here. So it's to see the most vulnerable in our society and sit with them in their affliction. And then it says, the second thing is to keep yourself unstained by the world. What does that mean? We can attribute a lot of modern day values to what that means. But in this context, it means to keep your Genesis face, your original, your created intention of who God made you to be, unstained by the world. the corrupt value systems that treat people like commodities and say, widows and orphans are not that important, they don't contribute much to society anyway, let them be somewhere else. That is a corrupt worldly system that treats people like commodities and puts value based on what they can produce in the world. It has nothing to do with your Genesis face or my Genesis face, because we have value and they have value before they accomplish or fail. And then the unjust treatment of, keep yourself clear from unjust treatment of the vulnerable and proud displays of pomp and power. And here, this whole passage of James is talking about how to be here in the midst of the world as a person of faith. He says you can't fix it out there until you fix it in here, because the value systems out in the world are just reflections of our accumulated value systems as a people. And if we believe that we can overcome evil with evil, then we're just going to perpetuate the evil that we seek to remove. And what James is trying to get us to see here instead is to become poetic in our expression of who God made us in this world in such a way that it creates beauty in this world, and it also authors God's justice in this world, because it's tied to this idea of God being this consistent force of goodness that we started this passage in verse 17. Because we can't fix it out there until we fix it in here. Then we can go out and start authoring justice in the world.
In the busyness of this day, grant me a stillness of seeing. In the conflicting voices of my heart, grant me a calmness of hearing. Let my seeing and hearing, my words and my actions be rooted in a silent certainty of your presence. Let my passion for life and the longing for justice that stir within me be grounded in the experience of your stillness. Let my life be rooted in the ground of your peace. Let me be rooted in the depths of your peace. Benediction by J. Philip Newell.
My favorite part is coming up. I'm excited. True religion, because there is a very, very famous and common phrase in this book that is escaped my mind. Not to go and try and argue our points. Dang it. Who the heck's Abbott? Why is he calling me? I'm trying to preach.